I was convinced that I probably had a gluten sensitivity too. And it's like all these things I just like kind of made up in my head as justification for why I couldn't eat a certain thing. And, I just like removed all of that. And I was like, okay, you're going to take off all these restrictions.
Welcome to the Eat for Endurance podcast. My name is Claire Schornstein, and I'm a registered dietitian based in New York City. My guest today is Mario Fraioli. You may know him from his newsletter, The Morning Shakeout, or from his podcast of the same name. I certainly am big fans of both. But he's also a well-known coach and a runner himself. We got into a lot of different topics today, and I think you're going to enjoy it. We spent a particularly long time talking about Mario's past struggles with disordered eating, which he's been very open about in various places. I wanted to explore how he kind of got into and, of course, out of this part of his life and the impact it had, any health implications, and of course, where he's at now and any advice he has to offer for those who are currently in that type of struggle. So I hope you enjoy it. Stick it out. I know it's a long one, but well worth a listen, at least in my opinion. So without further ado, Mario Fraioli. Hey Mario, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Claire. How are you?
I'm great. I'm very pregnant at the time of recording, but otherwise I'm doing well. So you're a very busy guy. You just got back from UTMB. You were on vacation. We were just chatting a bit about Maui and our mutual love for the island. You bought a new home, I believe, and you're about to go travel off somewhere else in a couple of days. So I'm glad I caught you in this brief window. So welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
And as you know, today really is, these athlete nutrition profiles that I'm doing, it's really about just sharing your story as an athlete and in your case as a coach through a nutrition lens. So I'm excited to hear all about you and your nutrition, of course. So let's dive right in, starting with when you were young. What was the food scene like in your house growing up?
That's a great question. No one's ever asked me that before. It was, looking back, I think it was pretty normal. We didn't follow any sort of specific diet in our household or nutrition protocol. My mom comes from kind of a big Irish Catholic family. My dad is very Italian, from Italy, and did most of the cooking in our household. And we would have pasta dinner every Sunday through high school. That was just sort of a staple for us. Friday night, we would go out to eat as a family. That was sort of our night out. Usually we'd go do pizza, or during like Lent, we would go and have fish and chips and stuff like that. But we would have, looking back, pretty balanced meals throughout the week. There was always some sort of protein, whether it was like chicken or steak or fish. That was with most of our dinner meals. I remember going to school. My dad would pack a lunch for me, and he'd always pack me like 2 sandwiches, and it was usually like bologna and cheese, maybe some potato chips, an apple, or some other kind of fruit. We would eat a lot of fruits and vegetables growing up as a kid. My family would eat salad. I never liked salad growing up, so I just kind of like avoided, that sort of thing. But it was just a very like kind of balanced, diversified, looking back, probably very Mediterranean type of diet, but we never called it that. It wasn't until like years later that I knew that was sort of a style of cooking that came from my dad's upbringing. But my grandparents, when they moved over here from Italy, they did a lot of their own, I wouldn't say farming. They didn't live on a farm, but they had gardens, like big gardens, and grew almost everything in their garden as far as vegetables go. Like I remember my grandfather had these huge zucchinis that would grow like along the fence at his house. He had a cherry tree. He had a pear tree. Yeah, he was very good with all this kind of stuff. I remember he like grafted some trees together. We had like apricots and other types of fruit. So, a lot of fruits and vegetables, but yeah, pretty just diversified diet. Nothing was ever off limits. But I didn't like salads growing up. I didn't really like eggs. I didn't like peanut butter, even though my siblings did, but that stuff was never like kept from me. I just didn't like it.
And has that changed now? Did you come to like those things or not so much?
Yeah, and that's why it's interesting because it changed, and some of it changed in college, and some of it changed after college. And now, I eat very much the same way as I did growing up. I don't follow any specific type of diet. I eat a good blend of, meat-based proteins, a lot of like vegetables. I actually do eat salads now, and tomatoes and things that I just didn't like as a kid. I can't tell you why that flipped, but it flipped sometime after, after college. I mean, there's certainly things I don't like. I don't like mushrooms. I don't really like olives, but, I don't restrict myself as far as the types of food, that I eat or follow any specific kind of diet. But, looking back, it's like, I'm not eating bologna and cheese sandwiches for lunch every day, but my diet's not much different than it was when I was growing up.
Awesome. And where did you grow up?
I grew up in central Massachusetts.
Awesome. Awesome. And you're now in the Bay Area, right?
Yeah, I've been in the Bay Area for a little over 5.5 years and been in California for a little over 9 years.
Awesome. Well, I'm originally from Santa Cruz. I don't know if you know that.
I did not know that. I was just in Santa Cruz.
Oh, it's such a fantastic place, and especially for running. And even though I did cross country in high school, I'm always kicking myself that I wasn't really into trails and doing longer stuff back then when I was growing up, because the trails around the Bay Area are just fantastic. You must be really enjoying that living out there.
I mean, as you just alluded to in your intro, we just bought our first home here. So we're planning to be here for a while, but it really is pretty heavenly. A lot of outdoor access, and at least in the Bay Area, a good variety of climates. We don't really get a true quote unquote winter, but it does get rainy here, get some cold mornings, but the climate is very conducive to being outside most of the year. And that's not something I take for granted.
Absolutely. So going back to your childhood, were you active as a kid, or, how did you first get into running and later coaching?
I didn't get into running until high school, and I got into running as a means of conditioning for basketball, running cross country in the fall, so that coach had told me I'd have better endurance for the winter basketball season. But yeah, growing up as a young kid, I played all the sports. Baseball, basketball was my first love, played on a soccer team. For me, like, pretty typical, like all my friends played on those different teams as well, and then we played outside pickup games and flag football and all that sort of thing. So I played a wide variety of sports growing up, and basketball was my first love, and I stayed with that through high school, and that's when I started running cross country and had some success at it right away as a junior in high school, and just missed qualifying for the state cross country meet, and pretty quickly realized that I had much more of a future in running than I ever would have in basketball. And I haven't stopped since. I mean, that was 1998, I believe, 1997 when I started running. And here we are, 22 years later, and still at it.
And, when you were, getting into being more of a competitive athlete, was sports nutrition on your radar? Were you thinking about food as fuel at all, or not so much?
Not much at all until after college. It really wasn't until after college that thought ever came into my consciousness. To that point, it was just I would eat when I was hungry, or if something looked good, or it was time to eat. But I never made the connection between the food that I was putting into my body, or thinking of it as fuel to keep me going as far as running goes until my early 20s.
So even, as part of a team with coaches and whatnot, so no one was talking about nutrition in that way for you?
Not really. Certainly not in high school, and maybe in college a little bit more. Our coach would make, I don't even want to say offhand comments, but, would probably, I can't remember a specific instance, but would caution us to, make sure especially if we were having like a night track race, or, leaving early morning on the bus for a cross country meet, just telling us to make sure that, we were eating well and had a good breakfast, because we were leaving, maybe we're leaving the school at 6 a.m. and the race is at 11 or something like that, and making sure that we, that we actually ate something in between. But as far as specifics, as far as what to eat, or having a balanced diet, or eating for recovery, or eating for overall health, we never had any of those types of conversations.
Yeah, got it. Now, so you graduated from college and you wanted to qualify for the Olympic trials in 2008, right? That was kind of one of the goals that you had, and you were taking running a little more seriously. And you talk about making this connection between, food and performance. So talk to me a little bit about how you got from not really thinking about food in that way to suddenly being like, oh, wow, there is a strong connection here and I need to focus on it more.
Yeah, so when I graduated from college, that was my goal, is qualify for the Olympic trials in 2008 in the marathon and try to make a go of it as a professional runner. And I was a good college runner. I ran Division II at Stonehill. I was an All-American in cross country. I had qualified for nationals on the track. So, I was a good D2 runner, but I wasn't good enough to land myself any kind of contract out of school where I could say, okay, this is what I'm doing for the next, 5 years. And there's a little bit of security there. But that's what I wanted to do. So I put most of my time and energy into that. And even the jobs that I was working at the time, they were, part-time jobs that gave me the flexibility to train and race. And when I started thinking about what do I need to do to make the jump from good collegiate runner to viable, like quote unquote professional who might be able to make a living at this, I started looking at the professionals who were making a living at it and what they looked like. And I can't tell you why that was one of the first things that I focused on. But I mean, you'd see the times that they were running, like, okay, this is what it takes to run at this level. What do these people look like? And I'd look at a lot of the guys, and maybe some of it was me being selective and looking at, folks who are about my height, which is 5'8", and I would try and see, like, okay, how big are these guys? Like, distance runners typically aren't big people, especially those who are competing at a high level. Maybe like that's the secret. I've got to look like these guys in order to run that fast. And you can start telling yourself some pretty interesting narratives when you go that route. And I had convinced myself that I was just like, I'd run good times, but I was too big to do what I wanted to do. I needed to drop about 15 or 20 pounds and be closer to 120 pounds rather than 140 pounds, which is what I weighed. And as you can probably tell, that started spiraling in a not so great direction. And first time in my life that I ever paid any close attention to what I was eating and how that might relate to weight loss and performance. And fast forwarding a bit here, but ultimately it stopped becoming about doing that for performance. And I went down this really dark road of just seeing how low I could push the numbers on a scale.
There was an article that you wrote about this whole experience, and I thought this quote was really a very telling one. You said, "Instead of focusing on how fast I could go or how many miles I could run, my main mission every day was to see how many calories I could burn. It became a game. I got more excited by seeing low numbers on the scale than I did by seeing faster splits on my watch." Like, that's eating disorder in a nutshell. You get so obsessed with things that are not the original priority, not the original motivators. I think you started from, you could of course share your story and your thoughts on this, but from my perspective, it sounds like, you started off really wanting something, you wanted to qualify and then got completely, just spiraled, as you said, completely sidetracked. People develop disordered eating and eating disorders for so many reasons. And you've been very open about it, which I know many, many people appreciate, because especially in male athletes, eating disordered male athletes is much more prevalent than people like to talk about. Thankfully, it's getting more attention now, but it's still not discussed as often as it should be. And a lot of people suffer and suffer silently. So I guess my first question to you in this time period, so you kind of made this connection between weight and performance, which is something I've talked about. It's come up in almost every one of my episodes because it's such this prevalent thing. It sounds like you did that kind of on your own. Like, did you have mentors at the time? Like, were your coaches, like, were you turning to somebody and being like, I want to take my performance to the next level? Like, what would you suggest? Or you were just kind of doing this whole thing on your own and making these connections on your own?
Yeah, that was part of the problem. I was doing it all on my own. I was a know-it-all at the time, 22-year-old, and I didn't want any help. And I think part of probably why I didn't want help is because I didn't want people to tell me that I was crazy or that I was thinking about things the wrong way. So this was all me. No one was giving me this advice. I'd landed on a lot of these things myself. And, in retrospect now, my primary occupation is coaching runners. And it was during that time for myself that I realized how valuable a coach could be. I had a great college coach and she wasn't able to coach me, after school. And I figured I could do it all on my own. But, it was during this tough time in my life when I didn't have a coach because I chose not to have one and didn't have any mentors that I think I ended up going down this road in the first place. Whereas I think if I did have a coach who was not only writing my training, but also getting feedback from me and trying to understand, where I was, I may have helped prevent me from going down this road, sort of in the first place. So it was definitely all on me.
Mm-hmm.
And, I was never clinically diagnosed with an eating disorder, but as you just described, like my behavior patterns were very consistent with disordered eating. And I most certainly ended up, that quote that you read of mine, I mean, that describes it in a nutshell. Like, I would go out and I'd be like, oh, well, 10-mile run, that's 1,000 calories burned.
Yeah.
And it's like, if that's 1,000 calories burned, then they say, like, your BSR is roughly like 2,000 a day. Like, that's like 3,000 calories for the day. So if I only take in like 1,000, like, I'm going to lose a lot of weight. That's going to add up. And that's a really twisted way to be kind of thinking about food and your relationship with it. And, that has nothing to do, I didn't mention the word performance in there or speed at all. It was all just like, oh, like, let me see, what I can do with these numbers, and then look on the scale and see if I drop weight. If I did, like, you get a little dopamine hit and you're like, okay, this is being successful. And you can tell yourself, like, well, this is what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to, like, make myself a certain size, and, like, I'm getting closer to that. But after a while, like, it doesn't even become about that. Like, you just get trapped in this very vicious pattern of like misguided thinking, and it can become really hard to get out of.
Absolutely. And often these things, again, the starting point was qualify for Olympic trials. I want to be a professional runner. But ultimately it seems just so barely in your head. And it's, these things come from other places, like issues of control, maybe certain tough emotions you're feeling or trying to numb yourself from and distract yourself from. And, disordered eating never is about like, oh, I just want to lose weight. Like, that's not what it's about. Right. So it's a very tricky thing that can get out of hand very quickly. So kind of along those lines, it seems like this developed pretty quickly rather than something where you observed red flags earlier on, like in college or such. Is that correct? Or can you look back and be like, oh, wow, I did see these kind of red flags around this at all?
No, it was all pretty quick, and it was all after college. I never had any of these sort of thoughts or behaviors or issues prior to, late 2004 through 2006 when I was dealing with all of this stuff. So it all happened after college. And to the point you just made about whatever else might have been going on in my life, like, in retrospect, I'm like, oh, I can see not maybe why this was happening, but some of the other contributing factors. And it was like, okay, I went from graduating college where I was around my friends and teammates, all the time. We're sort of in this together, and it was a serious pursuit, but it was fun. It was competitive, to being like, okay, this is what I'm trying to do now. I'm graduated and I'm putting all my time and energy into becoming a professional runner. And it's going to be this solo pursuit. And I'd moved out to Oregon for a little bit by myself and kind of got homesick and broke and ended up moving back home. And, then I'm living in my parents' house by myself, and I'm doing all my running mostly by myself, not spending a lot of time like in good social situations. And it's like, I had a lot of these other contributing factors that made me feel like kind of lonely and isolated. And, at the time, you're not thinking about those things. You just end up so focused on this one thing that you're trying to do. But in retrospect, things are a lot clearer, or in hindsight, I should say. And, I'm looking at it, I'm like, oh, well, there were some other like extenuating circumstances like in my life that certainly weren't helping my situation.
Yeah. I mean, you were running a ton. You were doing like 100+ mile weeks, right?
Yeah.
And so along those lines, like at this point, were you using any sports nutrition? Like, I mean, how are you getting through these workouts on so few calories?
Not easily. Wasn't really using, I mean, if I was using any specific sports nutrition, it was maybe like Gatorade after a run or something like that. But yeah, no like specific products or anything like that. I mean, I was just, I'm pretty hard-headed, pretty stubborn. I'm pretty determined. I mean, I was like willing myself through a lot of these workouts, but it was like, very minimal calories. And I mean, I was running a lot, and I was able to like move my body forward. But, because this happened so quickly as well, my performances really started to suffer, and I was running slower, and my workouts weren't quite as effective. And as you can imagine, like my body composition did change. And I mean, I eventually I eventually broke multiple times, like literally broke multiple
Yeah.
times because I wasn't fueling myself properly. Like I was literally trying to eat as little as I possibly could. And I was trying to keep it as, simple as I possibly could. It was like, a lot of like bread and, cereal and like bananas and like pasta and like just like kind of simple, bland types of foods that I knew had like carbohydrate in them, because I'm like, oh, I don't need protein. And it was just, I don't do any of this stuff that I'm talking about. It was, I'm lucky. I'm lucky it wasn't worse, and honestly, that I didn't end up like killing myself because of it. Because like in retrospect, I'm like, wow, that was pretty like extreme, but I think I was able to get through it and survive it for a period because I have like a good amount of like mental and physical resilience. But eventually I kind of got to the point where I literally broke physically and like mentally just kind of cracked as well.
And that took about a year, was it?
About 2 years. Yeah. Like
2
within
years.
about a 2-year
Wow.
period. Yeah.
I'm amazed you kept this up for that long without something more serious happening. That many miles off of so few calories and especially low protein. And you probably were losing tons of muscle mass, of course, putting your bone health at risk and everything.
So, I got my first sacral stress fracture in less than a year. Yeah, it was less than a year. And then I think that was the left side sacral ala stress fracture. And then less than a year after that, same stress fracture on the other side. And then at that point, like even around the time of the second one, certainly after it, I had improved my situation. My behaviors had changed. I was eating a lot better, taking better care of myself generally, but I'd done a lot of damage that,
Sure.
My body was still playing catch up. And I ended up having another stress fracture in my pubic symphysis, which the orthopedist told me he should not be seeing in a healthy male in his mid-20s. Usually that's something you see in elderly women and birthing mothers. That was a pretty big wake-up call to me as well. But at the time that happened, I knew where I had gone wrong in the past and accepted that I had made, some mistakes and didn't do myself, any favors and was taking better care of myself. But the damage had been done. And even though I was taking better care of myself, it was still like another sign to me that it's like, hey, you're still, you've still got some debt to pay down from trying to figure out exactly how long it was, but like say 1.5 years to 2 years that you just really weren't taking good care of yourself or your body.
Yeah. So you said you were living with your family at the time. They must have been noticing these dramatic changes in your appearance and behaviors. Did they make any comments? What was your reaction to them if they did?
Not till after the fact. Yeah, no one ever said anything to me while I was going through it. I think out of fear, and I think that happens to a lot of people. You don't know how to approach someone who is very clearly struggling. And the person who's struggling doesn't know how to talk to anyone about it. So you can see how, heads are going to butt there, where it's like, okay, like I'm going through it and, I'm aware that, okay, I'm kind of in this spiral now, and you don't know how to get out of it and you're too embarrassed to talk about it, especially if you're a male. In my case, living with my family, acting very strangely around mealtime and refusing to eat things that I typically would eat. And I knew my parents knew something was going on. You could see it like just sort of in their reactions to me, but they wouldn't say anything because they didn't know how to approach the topic and didn't want to create any conflict. And it wasn't until, after I could admit that I had a problem and was open to talking about it, that they were like, yeah, we knew something was going on, but we didn't know how to talk to you about it.
Yeah.
While I was going through it, people definitely noticed, but no one said anything. And until like one close friend of mine who had ran with in college, who had gone through some similar issues of her own, noticed changes in my behavior and certainly my appearance and called me out. And, that was a big turning point for me.
Yeah. And we're very appreciative of people like that in our lives. People have been through these types of experiences, having someone who has the courage to speak up and be like, hey, you have a problem, you have to deal with it. Because Otherwise, this could just keep going and going, right? Unless you have the ability to turn things around yourself, which, sometimes people do, but many times they don't. After reaching this like real performance low and you were injured and all these things were going on and you realized you had this problem, you had this conversation with your friend, you talk about, in this, like, again, I'm referring to this article I read that you share a lot about your experience, but you talked a bit about making these significant changes in your diet and eating behaviors and turning things around. Now, anyone who's gone through these types of struggles, they know, and I, of course, work with a lot of athletes and clients who have these types of struggles, often recovery is a very slow process. Progress is measured in millimeters. I mean, it's hard, when you've been doing it for a while. And not to say that everyone's experience is like that. Of course, some people can turn things around quickly. But I'd love to hear a little bit about how you were able to go from where you were at to making these improvements and changes. You talk about never being formally diagnosed with what I guess would have been called anorexia. And you were, kind of trying to make these changes on your own. But yeah, talk to me a little bit about that, about your recovery.
So just to rewind a little bit, had the first stress fracture, first major injury I'd ever had running, and didn't really change much. I was like, oh, well, this just happens, sometimes when you're training hard. And I cross-trained through that like crazy, which still, while dealing with disordered eating, isn't any better than running through it, but was still cross-training like crazy, trying to maintain fitness. And then I had this second stress fracture. And at that point, kind of accepted that, okay, I've put myself in this, in this position, and I've got to change some things. And I remember very vividly after that, I couldn't run. And I remember going upstairs to my parents' house, and in the refrigerator, and my mom had made some chicken salad, and I loved my mom's chicken salad. And, it's like shredded chicken and mayonnaise, and I think she put like some celery in it and like some other stuff. And I would not have I hadn't allowed myself to eat that sort of thing for like the past like year plus. And I remember just going in and like getting some bread out of the cabinet and opening the bowl of chicken salad and making myself like a big sandwich and just allowing myself to eat it and enjoy it. And it was like this huge weight off of my shoulders just to be able to go and do that. And I remember feeling guilt about it afterward and being like, what did I just do? Oh my God, I'm going to get fat, blah, 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 blah. But I realized like, and I don't know how I realized this, but I realized like I just needed to kind of sit with those feelings for a little bit. And I knew that was going to be like, I knew this wasn't going to change overnight. And I knew I was going to have like those, those types of moments. But to that point, I had restricted myself of a lot of things. Like I told myself I had a lactose intolerance, so I wasn't eating anything that had like milk or dairy in it. I was convinced that I probably had a gluten sensitivity too. And it's like all these things I just like kind of made up in my head as justification for why I couldn't eat a certain thing. And, I just like removed all of that. And I was like, okay, you're going to take off all these restrictions. And it wasn't easy by any means. I mean, I had to like kind of force myself into some of those situations and to like, eat on a normal schedule again and in normal amounts. And I wasn't always, successful. Like you have little moments of relapse, but I knew that I had to just like deal with that discomfort for a while and sit with it. And if I was able to do that, I was going to be able to eventually break through. And I did. And it took quite a bit of time, and it was very, self-driven. And, by that point I'd spoken to friends about what I had been dealing with and my parents as well. So I had some support, which was really, really helpful. And it was easier to talk about things from then on. But that's sort of how I was able to, get myself out of it. And I don't want to say like I got myself out of it as quickly as I got into it, but people who've dealt with similar issues, it can take a lot longer, and they go through a lot of, almost like relapse period. And you have periods where you feel really guilty about what you're doing, or have negative self-perceptions about how you look. And I certainly had a lot of that, but I just like, I learned how to sit with it and like be okay with that discomfort. And you realize when you sit with it for long enough, or at least I did, like it passes and you can break through and you can feel better about yourself and you don't feel guilty about what you're eating. And, that's how I was able to work through a lot of those tough moments.
Yeah. So it sounds like you were relying mostly on friends and family, and you didn't seek professional support at this point, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Do you ever still struggle with that old eating disorder voice in your head, or do you feel like you've kind of squashed it for the most part?
I've squashed it for the most part, but there are always moments where, for me at least, it's never, it's never extreme, and I never engage in the types of behaviors that I've engaged in the past. But there'll be times when I'll look in the mirror and be like, oh, am I, am I a little bigger than, I'd like to be or whatever. But I can push those types of feelings like aside now,
Hmm.
like pretty quickly. And as far as food goes, I eat when I'm hungry and I don't restrict myself of anything. And if something looks good, I'm going to eat it. And yeah, like most people, you kind of have those moments where, do I really need that third piece of cake?
That's normal though. Even that happens to me.
But it's like that's normal stuff. And
Yeah.
maybe
Yeah.
sometimes like I'll sit with a pang of guilt for a few minutes, but rather than letting it consume my thoughts and being led down this dark spiral, I can pull myself out of it before I get sucked down. And I mean, it's taken time. I mean, it's like I've been on the other end of it. I know how bad it is. And I don't know. I think I'm just way more self-aware now than I've ever been. And I have just good support networks in place. And I think that has been really vital in helping me to have a better relationship with food and my own body.
Yeah, absolutely. You're in your early 20s when this was going on, which is still this period of time when your body's changing and you're building your peak bone mass and all that stuff, and you suffered all these stress fractures. Are you still feeling kind of the health implications at all of this period of time? Anything to comment on there? I imagine, it took a while, as you said, to repay that debt that you incurred on your body.
Yeah, I mean, the two biggest and most obvious are I ended up having a lot of issues with my teeth. Like my teeth are just pretty terrible and weak, and I just wasn't nourishing my body. And I've dealt with a lot of like dental issues that no one's ever told me, but I'm pretty sure were related to this period because I never had problems before that.
Mm-hmm.
The integrity of like my nails, both finger and toenails, is pretty terrible. Are sort of brittle, and just from I've never had that told to me by a doctor, but just from things that I've read, that can be a consequence of just like malnourishment. And quite certain that's related too, because I never had those issues in the past either. But those are probably the most obvious ones. And I've had some stomach issues on and off that may or may not have been related to what I did to myself in my early 20s. But I mean, those aren't super consistent. So, I mean, the nails and the teeth are kind of the obvious part of it. But fortunately, like I've had my bone density checked and rechecked, and like knock on wood, that's all pretty solid. And like my heart's in good shape, which is good, because that can be where a lot of people get themselves into trouble, especially when they go to a very quick extreme like I did. You can make yourself really susceptible to heart issues. So like I've made sure I get that stuff checked out pretty regularly. And from an overall health standpoint, I think now, I mean, here we are 15 years later, I haven't had a significant bone related running injury since my last stress fracture, which is now like 10 years ago.
Right.
So it's like I feel really fortunate to be in that situation and just have a much healthier relationship with running and food and my own body image, and not dealing with any like chronic, as far as I know, long-term things that have like compromised my my livelihood.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you sharing all of these details of your experience and struggles with disordered eating. Now, of course, as a coach, I'm sure you encounter, some issues there. And obviously, like, I'm not going to ask you to share any details or anything, but as a coach, I mean, just having been through what you've been through and knowing what you know, I mean, are you kind of always on the lookout for these types of things and looking to really support people? Or I'm not sure. I mean, I know you work with some really high profile people with all kinds of distances. I'm not sure how young you go when, maybe I don't know if you work with kind of adolescent or young adult runners, but yeah, why don't you talk a little bit about that, like your perspective as a coach now?
Yeah. So I coach adults only.
Okay.
I don't work with any adolescents or school aged kids. But with the athletes that I do work with, all of them at this point are familiar with my story and my struggles, because I've been so open about it in public forums and written about it, and have talked to people many times about it. So, I mean, I've had some of my own athletes over the years who have been struggling and know they've been struggling reach out to me directly. And, we can certainly have a conversation, but then I can point them in the right direction to get the help that they need. And I've had other instances where I've just been around an athlete long enough where I can see changes in their behavior, and I can sort of spot it just because I've been through it myself,
Sure.
and I've seen it in other athletes as well. And I think because I've gone through it and I've been on the other side of it, I kind of know where they're at and can talk to them about it and approach it in a way that's not confrontational and intimidating, and at least just get like a little bit more information, get them to open up for the first time and have a conversation. Because, like I was describing earlier, people observed changes in my behavior and my eating patterns and my body, but wouldn't say anything about it. And, for me, it's like, if I kind of like my friend did for me, if I can see that in the athletes that I coach, like, my job as a coach isn't just to get them to run fast. It's to make sure that running occupies a healthy space in their life. Mm-hmm. And if it's not, I want to help them to bring that into balance. So, I've gone that route on it before. And then stepping outside of my one-on-one coaching, because I've written about this like in my own newsletter, and when I used to work at Competitor, and have done other interviews and podcasts about this, like I say it all the time to anyone listening to this, like, if any of what I've said or written sounds familiar, resonates at all, and you want someone to talk to, like, just, email me, get in touch with me somehow. And it's like, that's kind of one of those things where I just want to pay it forward. And it's like, I don't have the solutions to your problems, but I have enough experience at this point that I can point you in the right direction to kind of get the ball rolling, help people get the help that they need. And I look at that, as coaching, as much as, writing my own athletes' workouts and helping them work through their own problems.
I love that. Thank you. And I think I read one of your recent newsletters where it was like the state of the podcast. I forget what you called it. It was like the state of something.
State of the Shakeout. Yeah.
State of the Shakeout. That was it. And you're saying how, you can hit reply and reach you directly, and I was like, that's such an awesome thing. Even though you have such this wide reach, your podcast has over 1 million downloads. It's this huge thing now, but you can still be in touch with you, which is great. Okay. So we're going to move on now. So of course you coach, you host a podcast, you write this great newsletter, The Morning Shakeout, which is awesome. Everyone should check it out. And you're still running for yourself. You recently broke a longstanding PR at CIM last year. Is that right?
That is correct. Yeah. Marathon PR.
Amazing. So you must have been pretty stoked about that. And I think I saw somewhere that you're training for New York. Is that right? And you've never run it before?
That is correct. I am running New York City Marathon as of this conversation, a little less than 7 weeks from now. And it will be my first time running that particular marathon. I've been out to it in a work capacity 8 or 9 times. And last year I was out on the course during the race for the first time, watching my athletes that I coach during the race in like 3 different spots. And after seeing that, I was like, I gotta come run this next year and just experience this and see what it's all about for myself.
It's such a fun race. Tell me a little bit about like your sports nutrition, and after you got through this rough period of time, hearing a little bit about how you got to coaching and also how your nutrition started to evolve and how you started to work in nutrition in a healthy way, both for, supporting your training. So sports nutrition, like specific products and other stuff. And then of course, like your everyday eating and all of that.
Where to start with that? So as far as, running, I've never really stopped with the exception of the last 2 stress fractures. And the last one specifically, I took several months off of running and working out, which is the only time I've ever done that in my adult life, where I was just like, you know what, I got to put this aside for a while and come back to it, with a much healthier perspective. And as I was saying earlier, since then, I've, knock on wood, I've not dealt with any sort of major injury that's kept me out for a prolonged period of time. So I feel really fortunate in that regard. In terms of how I got into coaching, I've always been a bit of a training nerd. And in high school, I was on the cross country team and ran track, but we didn't have great coaching. It was just sort of, we raced twice a week and we didn't really do much in between the races. It was more social than anything else, but I took it seriously, and I knew that there had to be more to improvement than just running in the races. So I would go to the library and sort of teach myself as much about training as I could. And that's never stopped. I still do that now, 20 plus years later, and did that in college. And I was fortunate to have a great coach in college and be part of an excellent program at Stonehill, where I learned a lot and, had some great coaches and mentors post-collegiately that I learned a lot from. But it was after college where I had teammates that I had run with who wanted to stick with the sport and needed some guidance and just asked me to write them training programs. So I don't even know if it was coaching, at the time it was like writing like 10 to 12 week, training programs for, say, half marathon or cross country season that I would send off to my old teammates, and they would do it. And it was always exciting when they did well or hit their goal. And, that just continued to slowly gain steam. I was writing, eventually a few years later, I was writing training articles for Running Times and New England Runner and Triathlete Magazine, some other publications. And, people would read that, and they were mostly training related articles, and people would read that and reach out to me and ask if I did coaching. And I was like, yeah, sure. I do remote coaching. I'll figure out how to make that work. And a couple of those athletes are still with me now, like 10 plus years later. And
nice.
I spent some time working at a running shop in Massachusetts where I was living at the time, and we would have group runs from the store, and you'd have customers come in and ask if we offered coaching. And I was like, yeah, sure, I can coach you. And, I would meet older women at the track and like helping them like finish their first 5K, like literally like walking, jogging laps around the track. And, it continued to grow from there. I moved to San Diego and started coaching a group of post-collegiate women who were pretty competitive, and still coach many of those women now, even though I don't live in San Diego anymore. They've had some success, and I was working at Competitor and still writing about training. So, my name was out there, I guess, tied to a lot of these articles, and I had people reach out about coaching, and always something I did, on the side. And about 3 years ago, I went to work for myself, and coaching is how I spend most of my working time, and kind of my primary occupation aside from writing the newsletter and podcasting. So that's a very like truncated, fast forwarded version of how I got, into coaching. But, looking back in college, I ran cross country and track. I studied philosophy and psychology. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with my degree. I knew I wanted to do something in running. I thought that maybe I'd like to be a guidance counselor. I'd always like talking to people and, helping them work through things. And again, like in hindsight, like things that are a lot clearer, I'm like, oh, like the pieces were in place. Like I've always had this excitement around running and how people train for these events, and curiosity about, why you do certain things in training, but also had this desire to like just help people work through their own problems. And that's a lot of what coaching is. It's not just writing workouts and helping people get ready for races. That's obviously a huge part of it, but it's like, I look at my role as a coach as, almost like a life coach as well as, a running coach. Because as I explained earlier, like my main job is to make sure that running occupies a healthy place in your life, and that, it's supporting all the other things that you're doing, and, vice versa, that all the other things that you're doing in your life, that's all training, and making sure that that's supporting your running as well, and that you've got a good balance with those things. So I think that takes care of the coaching aspect of it. There's one more piece, I think, and I'm not addressing it, that you asked.
Well, before we get to the other piece, I was just going to say that reminds me a lot about what I do as a dietitian. It's not just about making, recommendations for meal and snack ideas. It is nutrition counseling, and it is making sure that food occupies a healthy space in your life. So it's very similar in that regard. And just as with exercise, and it's connected to so many different parts of your life, and it's not just about the training, and it's about sleep and the food you eat and all this other stuff, equally with food, it's not just about the food, it's about all these other things. So I think you can draw many similarities in that sense. So the other piece was about kind of your nutrition and sports nutrition and all that. So once you kind of got to a healthier place, and you kind of built this over time, slowly, this healthier relationship with food, what did that start to look like, and what does that look like now? So, what kind of products you're using? I don't know if you have specific products you use now, or what you're training with currently for New York, or like, what your everyday nutrition looks like. So yeah, just kind of paint a little bit of a picture for us in that regard.
So from a day-to-day standpoint, I've kind of gone back to like what worked for most of my life, just having a very balanced and varied diet where I don't restrict myself of anything other than the few things that I just don't like to eat. And I'm fortunate that, especially now, my wife loves to cook, and she makes sure that I have a lot of quote unquote green things in my diet. So I'm getting a lot of plants, and I've always liked fruits and vegetables anyway, but we have salad of some sort, like multiple times a week. We have some sort of protein like in our meals, and she's an athlete as well, so she's paying attention to that sort of thing, but it's just like a very varied, balanced diet. And I'm making sure that I'm not skipping meals or going too long, without eating. And then how that relates to my training and racing, it depends on the day, and the run and sort of like what's going on. So I'm fortunate in that I work for myself. I can make my own schedule. So I'm not on too tight of a time schedule as far as when I need to run. So I like to give myself time when I wake up in the morning. The first thing that I'll usually do is pour myself like a pint glass of water, and I'll pop like a Noon in there so that I'm having some sort of electrolyte drink first thing in the morning. And I think that's just a good way to start the day. And it's like the first thing I'm doing is downing, a glass of water with electrolytes in it. And I can't really speak to the specific benefits of that, but I feel like that's just a good way to start the day, because a lot of people, like athletes I coach, and I've certainly been guilty of this in the past, like you forget to drink like during the day. And I just want to like set that tone early on. So I'll do that. And then I'll usually throw 2 pieces of toast in the toaster, and, I'll spread either like peanut butter on them or like actual butter, like 2 buttered pieces of toast and a banana with coffee. And I'm giving myself, like, typically from the time I wake up till the time that I go running is, 90-ish minutes or so. So I'm doing that like within, the first half hour or so of waking up and making sure that I've got something in my stomach. And I hadn't always been that way. Like, I used to just not eat before I ran, but I found like whether it's an easy run or if it's a long run, just got to get something in my stomach. And I don't know if that actually like helps fuel the run, but I feel better. And I've been doing it for long enough now that, I know it's not going to cause me any issues like during the run.
Well, sounds like you're mostly doing carbs there, right?
Yeah, it's mostly carbs. It's quickly digested.
So it's certainly helping you.
Yeah, so exactly. It's giving me energy, and whether it's an easy run or a long run or, a workout of some sort, like that's what I'm doing. Easy runs, I don't typically take anything with me. Most of my runs during the week are 30 to 60 minutes or so. So I don't really, you don't need anything really. Where I run, there's water kind of along a lot of the routes. So it's like if I need to stop for water, like I know where I can get it. Longer runs take obviously a little bit more planning, especially when I'm training for marathons. I will take, or even ultras, like when I've trained for ultras, like that's a whole other thing because you're out for a long time, and I'll take like a handheld or a vest, and, I'll have plenty of fluids on me and a variety of different products. And it actually differs for me with like what I'll eat during a long run, depending on what type of training I'm doing. So if I'm doing like a long trail run and there's maybe some hiking involved, and, I'm just out on like slow terrain, quote unquote, I feel like because the intensity is not as high, I can actually take in more calories. And it's usually a mix of like some sort of bar. Usually I'll take like a picky bar or like one of the nut butter bars. I'll take a couple of those out with me, mixed with like maybe some spring energy gels. Like they're kind of all natural energy gels that I used for my last ultra, and I'll take those out on the trails, and their gels are, ranging anywhere from like 90 to 250 calories, and the consistency of each one's different. I kind of like that variety, but it's all like real food. So I feel pretty good about what I'm taking as well, and they taste good, and they just work for me. Like they just help me keep my energy levels sustained. And typically like in my bottles for like long trail runs, I'll have usually 2, and one's got water and one's got like either Scratch or Spring Electrolyte in it, which is just an electrolyte drink, and I'll try to, depending how long I'm out, I'll typically try to take down around 200 calories an hour or so, 2 to 250. I find I can get down like when the intensity is like a bit lower, and that helps keep me sustained and fueled throughout an entire run. Like right now I'm marathon training, so it's kind of, it's very different. I'm not going to throw a pack on. I'm certainly not carrying a water bottle with me, but I need to practice fueling, because you cannot, or you certainly could try and run a marathon with no fuel, but like for me, like I'm trying to race. It's not good advice. And I'm trying to race it, right? I'm trying to run fast. So like my engine's burning pretty hot, and I feel like I burn fuel at a pretty high rate. And I found what worked for me last fall. And I think a reason why I had such good success at CIM, it was actually the most I've ever been able to take during a marathon. And like what I'll do a little differently before like one of those long runs is I'll typically, along with my toast and banana, is I'll have a serving of UCAN. It's a super starch powder, and like I'll mix that up in the blender bottle, and I'll have that alongside my toast and banana and coffee an hour and a half, 2 hours out from the run. And it's easy on my stomach, doesn't cause me any issues. I find that it's sustainable energy, and it's just like, I think a lot of that is mental as well, but it's just worked well for me, and I've stuck with it for the last few years and the last few marathon cycles that I've run. And then like during, the race itself, and I try to practice this in my specific long runs for marathon training, is I've been using a product called Maurten, Maurten, and a lot of people are using that now. And I like it. I like it's got a very subtle flavor to it, so you don't get any kind of real palate fatigue or anything like that. And obviously during a marathon, for those of us who, even if you're running kind of fast, you're not getting bottle service out there. So it's hard to, get a bottle during the race. But what I did last fall at CIM, and what I'll do at New York, and what I've been doing with my training runs, is I have like this very small, like kind of 500 milliliter, or not even 500 milliliter, 250 milliliter like bottle. And like, I'll have a pretty concentrated serving of Maurten in that. And it's like just shy of 200 calories. And I'll actually start the race with that, and I'll drink it down over the first like 10K and just run with it. And then I'll take the Maurten 100 gels. It's 100 calories, like gel pack. I'll take like at least three, maybe four if I can get another one down, like the rest of the race. So it's like, during CIM last year, I got in like a little over 500 calories in 2.5 hours. I mean, that was the most I ever got in during a marathon, and I had great energy all day. And I'll try to replicate that on my long training runs now, just so that it's familiar and that I'm taking things at the same frequency that I'll try and take them during the race. And like, it's training my gut as much as anything else. And I'm not going to surprise myself on race day. And I think that's the biggest thing. And where a lot of runners will, mess up their nutrition plan, is they'll do something different on race day than they do during training. And you hear that all the time, and it's preached everywhere, but it's still amazing to me the number of people who will diverge on race day from whatever they've been doing, in training. And then, I think the final piece of like the sports nutrition puzzle is like what I do afterward, right? So after, an easy run where I'm not pushing myself very hard, I'm not out very long, I'm usually not very hungry right afterward, but I'll always like sip on some water or another type of like electrolyte drink, but I'm usually eating breakfast like right after that. So typically within, like half an hour, I'm going to have breakfast, and maybe that's like a couple scrambled eggs or like an egg scramble with like some peppers in it, or like chicken sausage or something like that, and more toast, or I'll get like a yogurt, something more like, I'll get more protein in, like I'll grab like a Greek yogurt or something, and I'll mix in some granola and berries and whatever. Or sometimes I'll just make up a shake and have like a protein powder in it, and like some berries and water and like some greens of some sort, typically like baby kale or something like that. So I'll try to get like a more protein heavy breakfast in afterward. And it's like 5 times, I'll just make an actual breakfast and have that. If I'm in a bit of a rush, it'll usually be like a shake of some sort, but definitely a more protein heavy meal. And I usually, like, I'm not rushing to eat right afterward, but I'm typically eating like within 30 to 60 minutes of finishing a run. And, that's just to kickstart kind of the recovery process. And then from there, I kind of get on with the rest of my day and eat lunch at a normal time. And I typically eat a later lunch and a later dinner, just because that's the way that our day, like to most people, but that's normal for me. Like, lunch is more around 2:00, like dinner's more around like 7:00. And I'll certainly snack in between. That's just the way my day is structured.
Okay, awesome. So a few thoughts. Spring Energy, I think you're the second guest I've had who's talked about it, and I hadn't actually heard of Spring Energy. So I definitely need to check that out, because I keep hearing good things about that.
It's a newer company. Yeah.
Yes, I've heard their name run around. I've tried Maurten. I do like their products a lot, especially their gels. They're like almost chewy. It's interesting.
It's like got the consistency of hair gel. I remember the first time I tried one, I was like, did I get a bad gel? Like, it didn't taste bad, but I was like, this just looks too clumpy to be right.
It's very strange. So a couple follow-up questions. So you mentioned doing Spring Energy during training, but then Maurten's during race. So are you not training with Maurten?
No, I'm training with Maurten for marathons and racing with it for marathons. I'll do Spring Energy when I'm doing like trail long runs and trail ultras. It comes down to an intensity thing for me. Like, the intensity of my long runs and marathons and the marathon itself is a lot higher than it is during an ultra, when it's a bit more subdued.
Yeah. Are you taking any additional salts? I mean, I guess you're taking the Maurten drink, which of course has electrolytes in it. Are you ever doing like salt pills or anything like that with the Maurten gels?
No, never salt pills. There's a little bit of sodium in the Maurten. I find that to be enough for me. I'm not a super salty sweater, but another product that I use, and this is mostly like long runs that I'll do this before. And whether it's an ultra or it's a marathon, I use a product called Precision Hydration. They have all these different concentrations of it. They have like 500, 1,000, 1,500, but it's essentially like a sodium type thing. And I'll preload typically the night before, right before I go to bed, is like I'll pop one of those into like a pint of water, and I'll have that, sort of the night before, sometimes the morning of, instead of just like straight water, but it's pretty high sodium concentration.
Awesome. And do you have a favorite distance? You mentioned ultras, you do marathons, of course. I'm assuming you do some shorter stuff. Like, what's your favorite thing to do?
Half marathon, somewhere in that range. 10-mile half marathon range is my preferred distance, but I've gone longer, I've gone shorter, but that's sort of the sweet spot for me in terms of training and the amount of time that needs to go into it. How you feel afterward. I mean, I'm pretty wrecked after a marathon. I don't know about most of you listening, but it's like I'm not in any kind of mood to run for a little while after that or get back into training mode. Whereas I feel like with half marathon distance, like it takes quite a bit of work to do it well, but it just doesn't beat your body up nearly as much as the marathons. And honestly, the ultras don't beat up my body quite as much as the marathons either, because of I think the intensity is a little bit lower and the terrain is a lot more varied, but they just take so much darn time to train for that it's a little more challenging from a time management standpoint. But yeah, 10-mile half marathon distance is ideal for me.
Are you signed up for any ultras later this year or next year?
Not yet, but I think next year will probably be an ultra year again. I jump lanes. I was telling this to my buddy Tim this morning, who I was running with, and I was like, the last 2 years I've been kind of in the marathon lane, and I've been focusing most of my energy on that and doing some shorter road races. And I haven't done an ultra since late 2017. I think 2020 is going to be an ultra year. So I think I might go back to the trails next year and just do some experimenting with like the 50-mile distance and maybe a little beyond.
Any races in particular you have your eyes on?
Not yet. I'm fortunate in that where I live in the Bay Area and surrounding area, there are a ton of options that I could do almost any time of the year. So I'm just going to take advantage of geography and just get through New York first and see how that goes and how I'm feeling afterward, and then start thinking about what I want to do in 2020.
So we talked a little bit about your, I guess CIM, we could have called that maybe one of your best race nutrition experiences. You got a lot of nutrition in, you performed really well. Do you have any other significant learning moments, whether those are successes or disasters from the past, that you'd like to share?
I mean, I've had a couple disasters in marathons, but I don't know what else I could have done about it. Like, so I have Raynaud's in my hands. So if it's really cold out, I just lose kind of all feeling and function in my fingers. And I've had a couple marathons where I literally have not been able to get gels out of my pocket. And all I've been able to do is like, maybe grab a water cup with two hands at a water station and get some water down, which obviously isn't giving me anything in terms of calories.
Yeah.
But I just haven't been able to fuel like during a race. That's happened a couple times. Boston 2018 and Boston like 2015. I remember like going up Heartbreak Hill in Boston of 2015, trying to pull the gel out of my pocket and get it down. And like, I didn't have any feeling in my fingers and it just like fell to the ground. I'm like, there's nothing I can do about it. So, those have been like sort of my biggest disasters. My first ultra, my first 50K, I totally bonked with like 10 miles to go. And I'd never run that long before, especially on the trails. And it was just a different type of race because the intensity varied a lot throughout. There'd be sections where I could run pretty fast. And, I think I was burning fuel at a pretty high rate. And then there were parts where it was like, just either really steep or sort of like downhill and you had to like slow down and you're just not like burning quite as hot. And I was just like underfueled. I just didn't get enough calories in. I remember hitting like 20 miles, being like 2/3 of the way through this race. Being like, how am I going to get through these like next 10 miles? But the cool thing about ultras is because, in a marathon, at least for me, like I would never stop. Sure. Like in a marathon, it might slow down, but you're not going to like stop and like take a little bit of a break. But in an ultra, you don't really mind doing that. And most people do. And you can come back. Like, so I remember taking just some time at, I think it was like the 25 or 26 mile aid station and like having like a bit of a feast there. I think I had like half a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and some M&Ms and some pretzels and like a little bit of Coke. And I probably got in like 400 calories or something like at that one aid station. And then I had a great last 5 miles. Nice. So, you can come back in an ultra, whereas in a marathon, you're certainly not going to do that. So that was an interesting experience for me because it was my first ultra and I'd never experienced that before. It was a good learning opportunity for me, but I'd say those are probably the most memorable ones.
I had your issue in the marathon and I literally couldn't get something out of my pocket. Like, I think I would just go to the side and ask some random person, be like, hey, can you open this shelf for me? I feel like that's what I would do, but maybe that's just me.
Yeah, I don't know. I was just like in a pack and I'm like, I don't want to lose the pack. I can't lose the pack.
Well, you are very, very fast. What's your marathon PR right now?
I ran 2:27:33 last fall at CIM.
Awesome. Do you have any goals for New York?
I'm not gonna say that directly.
It is a very different course versus CIM. It's flat and fast, right?
Yeah, CIM is definitely a much faster course than New York. I mean, obviously it's weather dependent, but I just want to execute a good race, and I still have plenty of time to train and another, like I said, little less than 7 weeks to go till the race. So there's still gains to be made, and I just don't know if I were to race this weekend versus like 7 weeks from now, like the results are going to be very different because I'm able to get a bit more work in. So I just have to see how this next 5 to 6 weeks goes. And I'm experienced enough at this point to know going into it with some degree of certainty, like how fit I am or what would be like a good day for me. And then I'll evaluate all the other variables and come up with a race plan. And I'll just try to execute that as well as I can. And hopefully afterward I can look back and be like, well, you ran to the plan. And if I can do that, I'll be happy.
Awesome. So one last question, anything kind of else on the horizon for you? Any cool projects with your podcast or anything else you kind of want to share with my listeners that it's coming up?
Sure. The answer is no. There aren't any real like new cool projects coming up, and I think that's a good thing. It's taken me kind of 3 years. As far as being like self-employed and coaching runners. My 3 jobs, I guess, are coaching runners, writing my newsletter every week, and putting out a new podcast every week. And it's taken me 3 years to get to that point where I found just a good balance with it. And I have a pretty good workflow that I'm happy with. And at the same time, I can't allow myself to get stagnant because eventually that will come back to bite me. So, I'm always paying attention, like, okay, what's the next evolution of this and how can it change? I don't know what that is right now, but it's like, it's kind of taken me the last 3 years to get to this point where I'm like, I'm pretty happy with like how things are going and like my workload, my workflow, and my work-life balance and all of that. And I want to be careful not to fall into the trap of like, what more can I do? Sure. What's next? Because I've done that before and I've buried myself in that way. And I always regret it afterwards. So I'm just trying to kind of appreciate where I am and that I'm where I hoped I would be, and it's taken me a little time to get here, and just trying to do the things that I'm doing as well as I can. I mean, that's kind of a boring answer.
No, but it's a good answer. You're prolific. I mean, the newsletter is great. It's weekly, which is a lot. Your podcast is weekly, right? And how many runners do you coach right now?
So I coach 25 athletes. That's max capacity for me. It's a lot, but over the last 3 years, like I've had up to like 34 athletes. Wow. I've had less than, I've had like in the teens, and I've just kind of found that right load for me. And I'm happy with keeping it there. The newsletter has had a weekly cadence now for 201 weeks. The podcast has had a weekly cadence now for pretty much the last year. And it's just like, there's a level of predictability with that, which is good for the rest of my life. And I feel like if I were to add on something new and exciting right now, that it would throw a lot of that out of balance, and that creates stress, and I don't need it. So, so I'm just going to try to do more of the same for a while, but it's going to evolve. It has to evolve, especially in, on the media side of things, like the world that we live in, the way we consume media, it changes. I mean, podcasting wasn't that big of a thing until it's been around for a while, but it wasn't that big of a thing until a few years ago. And now it is. And, with the newsletter, that wasn't that big of a thing for a while. And now it kind of is, but that could change. And it's like, if that changes and the way people are consuming content changes, then like where I deliver the content of the morning shakeout may change. And I've got to like be, kind of be ready for that. And then on the coaching side of things, I mean, I've been fortunate in that I have a lot of great long-term relationships with many of my athletes, and many of them have been with me for a while, but things change. People get injured, people move, people have babies, people take breaks. And it's like thinking about that in terms of like, okay, does that mean I can add on new athletes? Should I stay put? Because eventually like people do come back, and it's like trying to navigate all of that. So I'm kind of happy with kind of where things are at right now, and just trying to be content and see if I can be a better coach and be a better writer and be a better podcaster.
I think that's a really excellent place to be. And also, each, newsletter, each episode of your podcast, those are exciting projects in themselves. So I didn't mean that to be a trick question.
Well, and that's the cool thing is like they come out the same time every week, and like the workflow is pretty similar every week. But yeah, the newsletter is different every week. And then, like, I don't know what I'm going to write about, so I sit down and write about it. And there's, a freshness and an excitement with that, which is great. And the podcast comes out every Monday, and like Wednesday is my editing day. And I do a lot of recording in between, and every guest is different and their stories are different. I mean, I'm sure you're experiencing a lot of that yourself right now as you're recording episodes. And it's like, that's what's cool and exciting to me, because I know every time I interview someone, I'm going to take something new away from it. But like from an actual, workflow standpoint, I don't need to like add another show or do, another podcast, at least at this point.
Yeah. And podcasting, as I'm discovering, is a lot of work. Just all the back and forth and the scheduling and the editing in particular. Oh my goodness. I'm trying to get wrap my head around that right now still.
The best thing I ever did, if I can give you advice, and it definitely cost me like quite a bit of money until I started taking on sponsorship for the podcast, but I outsourced the editing from episode 1, and I'm fortunate in that I found a great editor, and I've worked with him for all 78 episodes now that I've done. And we have just as I said, like a good workflow as far as when I send him the next week's episode, but not having to worry about that because, as you said, the scheduling, which I do all myself, and that kind of coordination, that takes a ton of time. The research for a guest takes a while. Yep. And then, the post-production of like, okay, getting the show ready for consumption. It takes a lot more time than people think.
Absolutely. It's gotten to the place where, because obviously I have my own business, I also freelance elsewhere seeing clients, and I'm spending more time on the podcast than I'm seeing clients. And, this is a fun passion project for me. But, as I was telling my husband the other day when I recorded another interview with somebody, it's like these interviews, they're very energizing. And I know we're getting a little sidetracked from, the topics of nutrition, but, I think it's important, whatever you do, because there's always going to be grunt work. There's always going to be work that you do that you don't enjoy, and you just have to do it.
Yep.
But as long as there's some element of what you do that really gives you energy and really stretches you and challenges you intellectually, or just, I don't know, makes you be present. I find that podcasting really makes you forces you to be very much in the moment and just enjoy connecting with somebody. And you were saying how you enjoy doing in-person interviews, and I can absolutely understand that. And that part I really, really love. And I think it really goes nicely with just working with people as a dietitian, and that's why I love what I do. And, hearing people's stories and just sharing things with them. And of course, as the person, interviewing this time around, because I've been on many podcasts, I've been interviewed, and I'm still new to being the one interviewing. Yeah, it's nice just kind of listening and getting involved in a different way. So it's been a really fun experience so far. So we'll see where things go.
Well, I'm glad to be a part of it. Thanks for having me as part of the show.
Yes. Yeah. So we'll wrap things up with what I call my quick bites questions. And here we go. Okay. Favorite meal or snack when in a hurry?
To me, it's pretty quick. I can do it in less than 2 minutes. I'll throw a sandwich together. I'll usually just slice off 2 pieces of bread. I'll grab some turkey and cheese, and I'll just throw it together, and I'll head out the door, and I can eat it in the car as I'm going.
And what about when you're not in a hurry?
When I am not in a hurry, my wife and I on Fridays, we have Pizza Friday at home. So we make pizza. So we'll get the dough out, and we'll put the sauce on ourselves, and we'll slice up some peppers, and we do some chicken sausage and kind of spread the cheese and season it appropriately. And it doesn't take long at all. It's actually pretty quick, but we're not in a rush. We'll usually open a bottle of wine, and that's just our Friday night. That's what we do when we're home. Every Friday. And we cook throughout the week. My wife cooks throughout the week. I do pizza on Fridays, so we eat at home, most of the week, but Friday is kind of Pizza Friday. And it's just a good way to unwind at the end of the week.
Awesome. And what's your favorite post-race meal or snack?
A big fat burger, especially after a marathon, burger and fries. That's sort of my go-to. And it's usually a few hours after, once my stomach is kind of settled and I'm ready, for a meal. It's usually like a later lunch or dinner that day, but just, a big burger and basket of fries.
Nice. How do you like your eggs cooked?
Scrambled.
If you drink, do you prefer wine, beer, or liquor?
Not liquor. I don't do liquor, but wine and beer. I'll have both. Like my wife and I, as I said, we'll pop a bottle of wine on Friday and usually finish it at some point of the weekend. I like beer in social situations with friends, and it has to be good beer. Life's too short to drink crappy beer.
Yeah. What are your comfort foods?
Huh, that's a good one. Never thought about that. How would you define comfort food?
Well, the other part of the question I often ask people is what foods remind you of growing up?
Okay. So, I mean, the food that reminds me of growing up is just like any sort of like spaghetti and meatball type dish, because that's what we would do, on Sundays at our house. Like we'd have Sunday dinner. So that was just a very distinct part of growing up. I think as far as like comfort foods, I mean, I will left to my own devices, I'll just go grab a burrito most of the time. Maybe that's a comforting thing, but it's quick and it's delicious, and it's, at least I think, it's nutritious because you can just wrap a lot of stuff into a tortilla.
Absolutely. And you live in a good part of the world for that. So.
Yeah, we have great burritos here in California, so
Yeah.
I've certainly developed an appreciation for them in my time here.
What's your favorite ice cream flavor?
Vanilla.
Nice. I think that you might be my first vanilla. I get a lot of cookies and cream and a lot of mint chocolate chip.
My wife gives me a hard time because I'm so plain, but I'm like, it's a blank slate. I mean, vanilla, you can do anything to it, right? You can put chocolate sauce on it. You can sprinkle things on top. You can put Oreos, M&Ms, like whatever. But like, we were just at Dairy Queen the other day, and she's like, "What do you want?" I'm like, "Just plain vanilla." It was great.
I have vanilla in my freezer right now, and I always put like a big spoonful of peanut butter on top. The salty sweet combo, delish. Really good.
That sounds great.
Yeah. Top 3 items of gear that are most essential to your active lifestyle.
Running shoes, number 1. Sorry to any of you who are barefoot folks out there, but I need shoes on my feet for what I'm doing, whether I'm on road or trail. I'd say a water bottle, and I don't always run with a water bottle, but I've always got one like kind of at arm's reach. Like when I went out this morning, like drove to a trailhead, I had it in the car, so I had something to drink on the way there and something on the way back. And then even just throughout the day, like I've always got something close. So it's important to stay hydrated throughout the day. And, third, I would say, and this isn't all the time, but just good company. I love a good solo run and going out on adventures on my own, but I love running with people. Like I ended up running into a friend at Trailhead this morning and ended up doing the whole run with him, and I'll plan runs with friends throughout the week. And I think Christine and I are going to go for a hike this weekend, kind of in our new backyard. So it's just like, I don't know, it's just nice to have people to run and like share the outdoors with.
Awesome. And last but not least, who are you excited to interview next on your own podcast, The Morning Shakeout, if you're allowed to say, of course?
I typically don't tease out future episodes, but I can tell you who I hope to interview someday. I don't have this scheduled yet. My pie in the sky interview is Eliud Kipchoge. I'd love to sit down with him for an hour and just pick his brain and learn as much as I can and get him to tell some stories. But it's not happening anytime soon, as far as I know. But if it does, I will certainly let people know.
Well, I will definitely listen to that podcast episode for sure. Well, I listen to yours anyways, but that one I would very much look forward to listening to. Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Mario. I really enjoyed our discussion today. This is probably one of my longest ones that we've done. So I really, again, appreciate your time and appreciate you sharing your story.
Yeah, this was great. Thanks for having me, Claire.
Good luck with New York. I look forward to hearing how it all goes.
Thank you. It'll be here before I know it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, happy training. Have a good one.
Thanks, Claire. Bye-bye.
If you've made it this far, then major props to you. I know this was a very long episode, so my apologies / you're welcome. I really enjoyed the talk. I hope you did too. Again, that's Mario Fraioli, and you can find him at mariofraioli.com. He's on social media as Mario Fraioli on Instagram and Twitter. So check him out. He has a lot of great stuff to offer, especially his newsletter, which you can sign up for, and of course his podcast, both called The Morning Shakeout. Thanks for listening, guys. As always, you can reach me at eatforendurance@gmail.com or visit my website, eatforendurance.com. Have a good one.